Maybe you were a buffalo hunter in the early 1870s. Maybe you were a trail hand coming in off a long cattle drive from Texas. Perhaps you were a gambler, an enterprising businessman, or just a traveler on the railroad, stepping out from the train depot. Whoever you were when you arrived in Dodge City during its Wild West days, you needed to eat. And to do that, you needed to find a place to fill your belly. Well, Dodge City had you covered. Over the years, the city had a number of different restaurants to choose from. Today, we often consider restaurants to be their own business and have their own building. But during the time of the frontier, oftentimes restaurants were connected to other establishments. Hotels and boarding houses frequently had restaurants attached, but so could saloons, bakeries, and grocery stores. To learn what restaurants were in Dodge City and what kind of food you could expect from them, I've divided Dodge City's Wild West period into three portions. 1872 to 1874, the early period when Dodge City was a buffalo hunting town. 1875 to 1879, when Texas cowboys came to Dodge and when many famous Western personalities lived there. And 1880 to 1885, still a time for the Texas cattle drives, cowboys, and Western violence, but also a time of growth and advancement. The first business in Dodge City was George Hoover and John McDonald's saloon, set up in a tent on June 17, 1872. In the months that followed, business after business would open up in Dodge. One of these was the first hotel, the Essington House, and they served meals there. In November of 1872, two other restaurants were described as offering food. Peter Tashetta, an old Leavenworth man, is just opening out a fine restaurant next to the Essington House. Anyone wanting a good meal can get it there anytime, day or night. And M.D. Ryan has a restaurant and is no slouch in getting up a good meal. In November, the Essington House was described as a poor hotel under shingles, but by December, the hotel was almost completed. There is a large hotel in Dodge City kept by Mr. Essington, and now in good running order, although it is not quite complete. It has a capacity to accommodate about 200 persons. There are other eating houses in the place where guests can be accommodated. The Essington Hotel would later be renamed the Dodge House. What kind of food was offered at restaurants in early Dodge City? Well, it wasn't fresh fruits or vegetables. A traveler to Dodge City in 1872 commented that the only kind of vegetable that they were able to eat at Dodge was an onion. Wild game was an important part of the menu, not only for early Dodge City, but throughout its time as a Wild West town. What kind of game was eaten at Dodge? Predominantly what people in the West called buffalo, and to a lesser degree, antelope, referring to American bison and pronghorn. Between roughly 1872 to 1874, Dodge City was a buffalo town. Hunters killing the American bison mainly for their hides, but sometimes saving the tongues, humps, and hams. Henry Hubert Raymond, a buffalo hunter in Dodge City during the early period, kept a diary. On April 19, 1873, Raymond wrote that he, along with two other men, went out to kill buffalo, specifically for a restaurant. They killed 11 buffalo that day for the meat. Buffalo meat in early Dodge was plentiful and very, very cheap. Buffalo hams were said to sell for 1 cent to 2 cents a pound, and one merchant was reported to have 25,000 buffalo tongues packed away, waiting to be shipped on the train. As for pronghorn, they were numerous in western Kansas. In 1876, the Kansas City Times said, "The best antelope hunting district is west of Dodge City, on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, and east of Pueblo and Trinidad, Colorado." Even into 1879, hunters from Dodge City were able to bag pronghorn. Other wild game they may have served in a Dodge City restaurant include elk, turkeys, quail, and fish from the nearby Arkansas River. We learn from Henry Raymond's diary, Raymond often ate at restaurants in Dodge City when he wasn't hunting buffalo, that on January 16, 1873, he, along with Ed Masterson, the older Masterson brother, ate at a restaurant for 75 cents. 75 cents in 1873 is worth $18.52 in 2022. On August 15, 1873, Raymond makes a reference to Kelly's Restaurant. Kelly's Restaurant was one of the most famous restaurants in Dodge City during its heyday. It was referred to by many different names over the years. Kelly's Restaurant, the Kelly and Betty, the Betty and Kelly, and the Dodge City Restaurant. The owners were Peter L. Betty and James Dog Kelly. Peter L. Betty was appointed as Dodge City's first mayor until the first election that was held in April 1876. James Dog Kelly, nicknamed Dog because of his pet greyhounds, also served as mayor between 1877 and 1881, and was known as the leader of the gang political faction in Dodge City. The Betty and Kelly restaurant always ran large ads in the paper, proclaiming that it was the best restaurant in the city. During the mid to late 1870s, the Betty and Kelly restaurant was still one of the most famous restaurants of Dodge City. In 1875, the Leavenworth Daily Commercial described it. In addition to the hotel, the town can boast of a capital restaurant, kept by Messrs. Kelly and Betty, where everything can be had, from a venison steak to a roast of buffalo. They have the tenderest beef at Dodge I ever tasted on the frontier. In 1877, ice cream began to be offered at the restaurant. Samuel Marshall has opened an ice cream saloon at Betty and Kelly's restaurant, where he may be found every night, with the most delicious cream and cake. Families will be supplied on short notice, by the pint, quart, or gallon, at reasonable rates, by leaving orders with Betty and Kelly, or at Mr. Marshall's residence. Give the judge a call. The Betty and Kelly also offered fresh oysters. Betty and Kelly's restaurant is the headquarters for the numerous lovers and consumers of fresh oysters. And before I go any further, a note must be made about oysters in the Wild West. An ad from Tombstone, Arizona in 1885 proclaimed, "When you visit Tombstone and desire a good meal, oysters in any style, or in fact anything the market affords, go to Wisdom's Fountain on Allen Street, between 4th and 5th. And an ad in the Daily Pioneer of Deadwood, South Dakota, in 1878 stated, "At New England Kitchen, oysters fried 75 cents, stewed 50 cents, and raw 50 cents. In many Wild West towns across the frontier, oysters could be found. Oysters were a very popular food in the United States during the 19th century. They were relatively cheap and often served with alcohol in saloons. With the development of train transportation and canning, oysters could be delivered far away from the coasts. Oysters could be canned, and if properly chilled, last long enough to reach their destination. Raw oysters, still in the shells, were shipped in barrels, and could still be considered fresh for a month or two. Restaurants in the West that carried oysters often made it known in newspaper advertisements. It was a key selling point in getting people through their doors. Now back to the Betty and Kelly restaurant. In December of 1877, the restaurant had a different kind of attraction. Mr. P.L. Betty has a Nancy cat that beats any Nancy cat for size in this country. This remarkable cat weighs 18 pounds and is on exhibition at the restaurant. A different kind of advertisement, but it probably brought people there. Even without a large cat, the Betty and Kelly often received praise by anybody who tried it. One of the most popular restaurants in this vast region is that of Betty and Kelly. Their table is furnished with the best that can be obtained, and is served in the best style of the culinary art. When in want of a square meal, do not fail to drop into the popular restaurant of Betty and Kelly, two of the best caterers in the country. But the Betty and Kelly did have competition. In 1876, John A. McGinty and Larry Deeger had a saloon that offered food called the South Side Saloon. They later renamed to the Southern Restaurant, but it was a failure, and by the end of 1877, it closed and the building was left abandoned. A bigger competitor to the Betty and Kelly was Leonard's Restaurant and Oyster Saloon. It advertised meals at all hours and fresh oysters received daily. In 1877, the Dodge City Times described Leonard's Restaurant. Leonard's Restaurant, F.J. Leonard. Fred is a caterer of the highest order. His restaurant is finely furnished in tableware, cutlery, etc. He is an accommodating, sociable, and affable gentleman, and has a first-class patronage. His table is furnished with the finest the market affords, and the most fastidious palate, or the epicure, can satiate their appetites at his board. Mr. Leonard furnishes fresh oysters in season, and he serves them up in every style. Leonard's large dining hall is well furnished and attractive, and his accommodations being ample, he can serve parties on the shortest notice, with a meal gotten up in the finest style of the culinary art. The charges are reasonable, and satisfaction given. In 1879, the Betty and Kelly restaurant received a makeover. The original building was moved away, and a 2.5-story structure was built and took its place. The second story was used for entertainment and was referred to as the Opera House, while the first floor housed the restaurant, saloon, and barbershop. Between 1880 and 1885, Dodge City had not only grown in population, but shipping of cattle from Dodge peaked in 1883 and 1884. More people living there and more cowboys coming up the trail meant more business, and many new restaurants were opened to meet demand. In 1881, the Betty and Kelly, also known as the Dodge City Restaurant, was renamed the Grand Central Restaurant and became managed by Thomas J. Draper. The change was mentioned on January 4th, 1881 by the Ford County Globe. Mr. T.J. Draper, on the first of the year, opened out in the restaurant and saloon business at Mayor Kelly's old stand, which will hereafter be known as the Grand Central Restaurant, which is destined to become one of the most popular places in the city. Mr. Draper has secured the services of Mr. George F. Jones, who has charge of the saloon department. We predict for Thomas a lively business during the coming summer, and more especially during the cattle season, as he has a large acquaintance among stock men. Even though it changed names and management, the Grand Central Restaurant was still an important place to go and eat in Dodge. After changes were made, it was advertised, "The Grand Central Restaurant is now open for spring and summer, and the proprietor, T.J. Draper, will spare no pains and expense in making the Grand Central the leading restaurant in the West." Thomas Draper had an idea to help business. He decided to turn part of the building into a hotel. Tom Draper intends soon to have the hall over his restaurant partitioned off into sleeping rooms. By the end of May, the work had been completed. T.J. Draper, proprietor of the Grand Central Restaurant, has about completed the hotel portion of his house, and in a few days will be ready to announce to the traveling public that he will be able to furnish lodging to the weary traveler, as well as food. His house will hereafter be known as the Grand Central Hotel. The Grand Central Hotel advertised as having meals at all hours, and being the only first-class restaurant in the city. At first, business seemed to be doing well. In August 1881, it was published, T.J. Draper of the Grand Central Hotel for the past month has been feeding as high as 100 guests at one meal. Business must have dropped off for the hotel, however, as it later became Mysterious Dave Mather's Dance Hall. One of the new restaurants was known as Bay's Restaurant. Advertised as a restaurant and bakery, it had confectionaries, vegetables, hot coffee, oysters, but also sold cigars and tobacco. In describing Bay's restaurant, the Ford County Globe said, "He carries a full line of all kinds of confectionery supplies and aims to keep constantly on hand fresh bread, pies, and cakes. A word to the hungry is sufficient. Meals at all hours, prices reasonable. Call on him." Fresh eggs and butter were always at hand at Bay's restaurants, and even homemade candy. In the November 27, 1880 edition of the Dodge City Times, two restaurants advertised next to each other. A restaurant by Charles Dickerson that had warm meals, bread, cakes, confectionery, etc. And below that, the restaurant owned by A.J. Peacock, which let you know they had fresh oysters constantly on hand, and that lunch could be served at all hours. The Dodge House Hotel was still serving meals, and received even more business because of the railroad. It would be interesting to know how many meals the Dodge House furnished the passengers of the belated trains. This house has the contract with the railroad company, but other hotels and restaurants also supplied the detained passengers with grub. For a few days, there was a rush and a jam. Several thousand meals were furnished during the embargo. M.P. Johnson owned a restaurant, advertising in 1881, "Open door at the restaurant stand formerly kept by W.H. Steele. I will give satisfaction to anyone that will call. Everything in style, 25 cents a meal. Meals at all hours. Everything filled to order. Fourth door west of Post Office, Dodge City. M.P. Johnson, proprietor." There was the Bon Ton restaurant. Perry and Green have opened a restaurant adjoining W.W. Robbins' store and will be pleased to serve the public with warm meals. The Wright House advertised as being the finest and best eating house in the city, and also a headquarters for stockmen. Mrs. Steinman has opened a confectionery and restaurant adjoining M. Collar's store. T.J. Draper was back in the news in 1882. The Capitol Chop House and the Opera House Restaurant, under the control and management of T.J. Draper, are both doing a land office business. Tom knows how to set up a good meal, and the boys like to dine with him. The Capitol Chop House and Opera House Restaurant also advertised as being a headquarters for stockmen, trying to get as many Texas cowboys there as possible. There was the Indiana restaurant, which was part of a grocery store. The newspaper let everyone know that fresh lemons and oranges had just arrived there. And a new restaurant was opened on Front Street that was part of a boarding house, operated by Mrs. Carrie L. Bryan. One of the most talked about restaurants, in conjunction with a saloon, was the Lone Star Saloon and Restaurant, operated by Hines and Kramer. The name Lone Star was another way of grabbing attention by Texans. It promised, "The finest and best of everything will be served." In 1883, you could get ice cream at the Lone Star, as well as oysters, prepared a variety of ways. Hines and Kramer also updated their ad in 1883. "Choice wines, liquors, and cigars, and the best restaurant and lunch stand in Dodge." The Lone Star didn't skimp for Christmas either. Get your oysters, fish, and game for your Christmas dinner at the Lone Star Restaurant. And the fattest lot of Christmas turkeys and fine fresh cranberries at the Lone Star Restaurant. In 1884, we learn where the Lone Star got its fish and the person who was in charge of bringing wild game to the table. The Lone Star Restaurant has been painting, papering, and refitting its private dining rooms to meet the rush of the convention. Charlie receives his lake trout directly from Boulder, his salmon from Oconomowoc, Wisconsin, and his lobsters from Toronto, Canada. His game department is under the supervision of Bat, the well-known culinary connoisseur and caterer. Bat could only refer to Bat Masterson, who was in Dodge City in 1884, and he did have connections to the Lone Star Saloon. He listed the saloon as his address in 1884, and was also a house dealer there. In 1885, Hines would transform the Lone Star Restaurant into the Delmonico. Heinz's Delmonico. The past 10 days, carpenters, painters, and paper hangers have been busy fitting up the Heinz place. Until now, it is already the finest dining room in the city, and the work of improvement is not yet completed. In addition to his already complete supply of table silverware, yesterday Mr. Heinz received an invoice of $500 of table silver. The Delmonico will open about the 1st of April, and from present appearance will be the toniest restaurant in western Kansas. The Delmonico became one of the most famous restaurants of Dodge City. The restaurant was even depicted in the TV series Gunsmoke. Some more restaurants included the Union Restaurant, Bond and Nixon, which was a first-class restaurant attached where oysters, game, and all delicacies in season will be served, the Old House Restaurant, the Old Corner Restaurant and Lunch Counter, the Ice Cream Parlor Restaurant, C.G. Bragg's Restaurant and General Confectionery, and the St. James Saloon and Restaurant. Finally, we have a restaurant by Hamilton Bell, known locally as Ham Bell. Bell owned the Elephant Livery Stable, was a deputy U.S. Marshal, and served as sheriff of Ford County from 1888 to 1892. Ham Bell's restaurant advertised in 1885, "Ho, ye hungry, look here. Square meals for 25 cents, plenty, tidy, and wholesome. Cowboys and Grangers welcomed. Bell's Restaurant, near Elephant Livery Stable. Smith and Ellis proprietors." Bell's Restaurant was quite popular. 150 men for dinner at Bell's Restaurant yesterday, with 6 or 8 other restaurants, and as many hotels and boarding houses in the city, shows a pretty fair trade in that business. Restaurants of one form or another would always have a place in Dodge City. The saloons, however, were the target of the temperance movement. The Dodge City Times of March 19, 1885 discusses the fate of some of the saloons. Several saloons closed soon after the new temperance law went into effect. Several saloons keep open doors, but whether the sale of liquors is carried on, we cannot say. But the inference is that whiskey, under another name, is sold on the sly. 2 or 3 saloon places are being converted into restaurants. It is probable that half the number of saloons will continue in operation, selling drinks, and stronger ones to the initiated. Restaurants in Dodge City evolved with the town, from simple wooden buildings serving local game to polished and refined dining establishments. But no matter what year you visited Dodge City, you could be sure to find a place to sit, relax, and enjoy a good meal.